there, deep divers. It's Julie B, and this is part 2 of a deep dive into season 2, episode 5 of Severance, Trojan's Horse. This is not a recap. I'll give you my ideas, impressions, and theories about the innie side this time of what went down in this episode, including the shell-shocked reactions of the MDR team to the events of the Ortbo retreat, Dylan's discovery of Irving's drawing of the export hall, and of course, the mystery man collecting dental tools to take to the testing floor, plus much more. So without further ado, let's get into it. The episode opens with an unidentified man wheeling a cart to O&D, collecting a set of dental tools from the staff there, then taking them to the export hall and into the elevator to the testing floor. All the while, the cinematography explicitly conceals the man's face from us. He's filmed from behind metal shelving here. Then we only see the back of his head as he walks down the export hall to the elevator, and just as he's about to turn around in the elevator, at that exact moment, the camera cuts to a long shot, thus making it impossible to get a glimpse of the man's face. All of these are obviously deliberate choices on the part of the cinematography and the directing. So my immediate reaction was to assume that this man's identity must have significance, probably a character to whom we've already been introduced, or, as someone in my Discord watch party suggested, it could have turned out to be a surprise cameo from showrunner and director Ben Stiller, who have said that he plans on doing a cameo at some point. However, the credits revealed that the actor is actually just Robbie Benson, not someone who has played a role on Severance until now. So the explicit concealment of his face is strange, but maybe the point was just to emphasize the mysterious nature of what the hell is going on with the export hall and the testing floor. It's so mysterious that we weren't even permitted to see the face of this man who brought the dental tools there. He was whistling Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a haunting tune by Gordon Lightfoot, who was inspired by the real-life sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald ship in Lake Superior in 1975. He based the melody on an old Irish dirge, though. A dirge is a lament for the dead, particularly one forming part of a funeral rite. So the inclusion of this tune in the show was particularly fitting given the fact that the innie side of this episode centered around Irving's funeral. In the new opening title sequence of season 2, a car is shown sinking into icy water. A car that looks suspiciously like Harmony Cobell's distinctive vehicle. So that image, combined with the inclusion of this song, could be foreshadowing that someone is going to crash into a lake this season. Hopefully not Cobell. It seems to be part of Lumen's playbook to stage car accidents. Gemma was in a car accident when she supposedly died, but we've now learned that Lumen faked her death and kidnapped her, so they may even have orchestrated that car accident somehow. In the Lexington letter, a short story companion piece to Severance penned by Ben Stiller, an innie named Peggy warns her outie to flee because Lumen will be coming after her. Then, her outie, Peg, conveniently gets in a fatal car accident shortly after. I wouldn't be surprised if Lumen faked Peg's death too and kidnapped her to use her as a test subject like Gemma. Her recruitment to Lumen even began with an accident, a bus accident. She crashed her school bus, and that was the impetus for her decision to finally leave the job she hated and take a Sever job that a Lumen recruiter just happened to pop up and offer to her. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if Lumen somehow caused that bus accident as well. This seems to be their playbook. So, long story short, that image of the car crashing into icy water in the opening credits combined with the Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald song, it could be foreshadowing a potential crash, not a ship sinking, but a crash of a car into icy water this season. So we'll have to wait and see. Now, as for what this mysterious man is bringing to the testing floor, I can only surmise that the dental tools are for the test subjects who are being kept prisoner down there, including Ms. Casey. These people at Lumen are illegally kidnapping and experimenting on these test subjects, but apparently they extend to them basic care, including dental care. Also, I can't help but think of this. The dental tools could be a little nod to the way in which Lumen has faked people's deaths, such as Gemma. When people's bodies are burned beyond recognition, as Gemma's body was burned, dental records are used to identify them, and I'm sure Lumen paid people off to fake Gemma's dental records. But moving on, the MDR team reunite at Lumen, and they're all in a panic and traumatized by the events of the nature retreat at Woe's Hollow in the previous episode. So they gather in Milchick's office and fire questions at him, as Milchick explains that Helena was posing as Helly using something called a Glasgow block. Then the team realizes, of course, that Helena had been spying on them this entire time. Helly has returned to work as an innie for the first time this season, disoriented and traumatized by the revelation that Helena stole her identity. Helly feels like a totally separate person, and for all intents and purposes, she is. She has her own separate set of memories and identity, but she happens to share a body with Helena. She says Helena stole her body and, quote, she doesn't have the right to take my identity, unquote. So she feels violated, like Helena stole her body. And at this point, she doesn't even know that Helena slept with Mark, which makes it a much worse violation. Also, remember that from her point of view, Helly just went from being tackled on stage at the Lumen Gala in the season 1 finale one moment to the next moment waking up as Irving was trying to drown her. Her innie self had been essentially asleep in between those events, so that's extremely traumatic for her to have been in such a stressful situation and then to be suddenly thrust back into consciousness in such a terrifying manner. Now, to top it off, she finds out that Helena had stolen her identity for all that time, and the revelations are just going to keep on coming from there. In this episode, it's clear that Mark is traumatized by Helena's deception. He immediately questions if Helly is even really Helly. Even after Milchick says she's the innie, he questions this a second time, but more on that later. Meanwhile, Dylan is fixated on the fate of Irving, having developed a close friendship with him. He demands to know where Irving is, and Milchick just explains that Helena Egan was conducting valuable research in her executive capacity, and Irving didn't know about this and nearly drowned her, so their only option was permanent dismissal. Also, he lies that Irving's Audi left on an elongated cruise voyage. More odd water references in a series that's loaded with them for some strange reason. Dismissal or retirement of an innie amounts to their death, and this season is making that reality more overt. Dylan says, so he's dead. And although Milchick doesn't agree with that assessment, he does say something during Irving's funeral later that implies otherwise. But I'll come back to that. Milchick proceeds to tell them a nonsense propaganda story about the Grok Schupan. He explains that in ancient times, the king of Sweden was known to go incognito amongst his people in hopes of learning his true grievances, wearing an old gray robe called a Grok Schupan. He claims that Kier Egan was known to do so himself in the ether factories, and Miss Egan, as in Helena, was just carrying on this tradition. Incidentally, this is a complete fabrication. There was no such king of Sweden who did this in real-life history, and it's just more propaganda to control the innies. But the innies have lost their innocence. First, they were radicalized by Rickon's book in Season 1, then they all got to experience the outside world, and now they've been deceived by Helena all this time. All of this has left them deeply cynical and distrustful. Mark immediately dismisses the story as horseshit, and Dylan agrees. They're openly defying authority now and calling out the lies. When Milchick admits that Irving will not be coming back, Dylan calls the Lumen higher-ups effing murderers. Helly is also outraged, but Mark is remarkably silent about it, other than just saying, finally some honesty. Similarly, when Milchick shows them back to MDR and they see there are only 3 cubicles now instead of 4, only Mark is unbothered by the change and sits right down at his desk. Dylan and Helly are unnerved by it, because the setup of the 4 cubicles has been all they've ever known. But Mark is stoic and seems to be in a state of shock and numbness after the trauma of Helena's deception and the elimination of Irving's innie. He may seem indifferent in this episode, but he's emotionally shut down, and that's a typical trauma response. Dylan mouths off to Milchick, who subtly threatens him about taking away his privileges, which immediately makes Dylan relent. Letting Dylan see his Audi's wife has given Milchick a way to control Dylan, a privilege to hold over his head and threaten to take away, like a carrot he's dangling above his head. This season, the emphasis is more on the carrot than the stick method, as Milchick instituted kindness reforms and eliminated the psychological torture of the break room. Still, Dylan does speak up enough to demand a funeral for Irving, not a retirement party, because this should be recognized as a death, and innies are people. Similarly, in Season 1, Irving mouthed off at Milchick in the O&D department for standing around having a party just to watch Bert die. And Mark once told Miss Casey that they're, quote, people, not parts of people. These are our lives, even with what little they give us. No one gets to just turn you off, unquote. But now, Mark has emotionally shut down, so he just coldly says he supports the funeral idea if it doesn't take up the whole day. It's not that he doesn't care about Irving. Again, his behavior throughout this episode is a trauma response due to Helena's deception and violation of him. Milchick relents and he agrees to a funeral, ordering Ms. Wong to ready a bereavement kit. Clearly, Milchick has a soft side and regards the innies more like people, while Cobell, Ms. Wong, the board, Drummond, and other upper management look at them as subhuman. Check out part 1 of my episode 5 deep dive, Where is Cobell and Why Does Cold Harbor Matter, for more on that topic. As Mark has a coughing fit, which, incidentally, is a side effect of his reintegration and also happened to Petey in season 1, he goes to the men's room and Helly follows to check on him, coming in even when he doesn't respond to her. Mark is cold to Helly because he's shell-shocked by Helena's deception and doesn't know what to think anymore, whether he can trust Helly or not. He has no way of knowing if it really is Helly now or not. He's also questioning if there even is a real distinction between the two of them at all at this point, since Helena was able to fool him and imitate Helly so easily. I mean, what is the difference between them, really? He's questioning everything. I talked about the concept of love goggles in my episode 4 deep dive, how Irving had lost his love goggles after the loss of Bert and became totally disillusioned and distrustful of everything, while Mark was still gullible and blinded by his feelings for Helly. But now it's safe to say his eyes have been opened, and he's struggling to trust anything in this episode at all. Also, remember, Helena violated him by sleeping with him under a false identity. He didn't consent to sleeping with her. He thought he was with Helly, so he rightfully feels violated, and he exhibits all the signs of a classic trauma response during this entire episode. Emotionally shutting down, expressing anger, blocking out his feelings, and pushing people away. He won't talk to Helly about what happened to him. He doesn't want to hear about what happened to her, and he says they should just try to forget it. Now, I have to point out, once again, I love the way the show uses reflections to constantly remind us of the duality of these people's existence. Look at the reflection of Helly in the mirror, prominently featured in this scene, to remind us that Helena is still very much within her as she's speaking to him. So many surfaces in the sets are unusually shiny and show us the characters' reflections. Shelving units, walls, tables, you name it, all to remind us of the duality of the people's identities on this show. And of course, the use of mirrors as well, which are even more obvious. The show even uses this technique with people who aren't severed, like Drummond, Milchick, etc., as if to suggest that all of us have a kind of shadow self, a part of ourselves that we conceal from others, or even that we conceal from ourselves and bury deep within us. For instance, this man who's bringing the dental tools to the testing floor. We don't know if he's severed or not, but look at that striking reflection in the cabinets and drawers to his left. And in the conference room scenes between Drummond, Natalie, and Helena, their reflections are also present all the time, despite the fact that these two are not severed as far as we know. The same goes for Milchick's scenes in the conference room as well. The exterior of the Lumen building itself is entirely covered in mirrored glass. The interior walls and even some of the doors in the upper floors are mirrored or shiny, like this door right here that's actually covered in a mirror, so you couldn't even tell it was a door until someone actually walked through it, and the tables are shiny as well. So reflections are ubiquitous in the show and remind us that everyone has a kind of shadow self within, not just the people who are severed. Moving on, as Ms. Wong points out to Milchick, Lumen only has funerals for innies who die at work, but he tells her that Irving's affections index was high and this will help the innies move on. So apparently, somehow, they actually measure the amount of affection that innies have for each other, and who knows what other data they're gathering from their chips. So Milchick is breaking protocol and allowing them to have this funeral, and he's already relenting from his previous hardline stance in episode 4, when he told Irving that there would be no trace of him left to show that he ever existed at all. Now, he did follow through on removing Irving's cubicle and belongings, as he said he would, and somehow he edited him out of the pictures on the MDR desks, which is just downright creepy. But he allows them to have this funeral, and it shows that he's more humane and compassionate than the other Lumen overlords. Then Milchick plays a video with an animated version of Irving on it that looks straight out of a pixelated 80s video game, with a video game version of a dirge playing in the background. Then we have pseudo-religious language yet again, as the cult-like messaging has become more overt this season. Milchick says normally when an innie goes to be with Kier, we hold a retirement party which they attend. He also says they should take 9 seconds to remember Irving and thank Kier for their time with him. This language tells us that Lumen does recognize that retirement or termination of an innie is equivalent to a death, and that workers recognize this reality as well. And the concept of an innie going to be with Kier is an obvious parallel to the concept of a person dying and going to be with God. Then, of course, there's the statement that they should thank Kier for their time with him. This truly is a cult, worshipping Kier as their god and preaching that he's somehow responsible for bringing the innies into this world. Then Dylan delivers a sweet and funny eulogy for his friend, making a reference to his feelings of guilt for not listening to him or helping him with something near the end. Milchick declares that they may now partake in Irving's fruit head. He ushers Ms. Wong out of the room before she can play the theremin as she had planned, seemingly to get back at her for her questioning his judgment about having the funeral, and her passive-aggressive comment about his performance review that I discussed in part 1 of this deep dive. It's pretty ghoulish how they're eating a likeness of Irving's head. Interestingly, Dylan takes a large hunk off of it, and it happens to be Irving's left ear. This symbolically represents Dylan's guilt for not listening to Irving and helping him before he was terminated. And incidentally, in episode 4, Irving's hat was on crooked from the very start, with a close-up shot of his face. Thus, this crooked hat exposed his left ear and foreshadowed what was to come in an eerie way. Furthermore, Irving's watermelon head losing its ear is likely also a reference to Van Gogh famously cutting off his own ear. And it's fitting because Irving's last words to Dylan included a hint that he needed to look behind the break room poster that reads, "Hang in there." It's not a painting per se, but still, it seems like a reference to the painter Van Gogh, given the fact that Dylan is eating that watermelon ear right before he investigates the poster. It also fits because Irving basically brought his fate upon himself, just as Van Gogh chose to cut off his own ear. As Irving threatened to drown Helena, he knew that he wouldn't make it out of that situation alive, with the attempted murder of an Egan. Just after telling Irving via his fruit head that he's sorry he let him down, Dylan turns to leave and sees the "Hang in there" poster on the wall, triggering an epiphany that dawns on him. Reaching behind the poster, he finds Irving's drawing of the export hall, and on the back, he sees detailed written directions for how to get there through the maze of hallways. On Irving's last day at work, he had tried to get Dylan to come with him to search for that place in the drawing. He had drawn it from memory based on the paintings his Audi had created, and he thought it might be located somewhere on the severed floor. But Dylan was too wrapped up in getting his work done so he'd earn the perk of seeing his Audi's wife, so he declined to help. Later, Felicia from O&D saw Irving's drawing and asked how he knew about the export hall. She explained that O&D used to take deliveries there, but now they have a guy who comes and picks up the items. Irving had asked her if she still remembered how to get there, and then the scene cut without revealing her answer. I figured this would later lead to a reveal, and here we are. Clearly, she gave him directions which he wrote on the back of the drawing. Now this is Dylan's chance to make up for failing his friend. He puts the drawing back behind the poster, but I'm sure he'll eventually come back and use it to find the testing floor, or at least give it to Mark and Helly so they can locate it. Since Dylan knows they're likely being watched at all times, he's probably just keeping the drawing there for safekeeping, since that's what Irving had done. I'm sure that Irving planned to search for it himself, but just never got the chance. But backing up a bit, during the funeral reception, Hallie and Dylan act appropriately for people attending a funeral and comfort each other, while Mark just keeps to himself and looks completely detached from the situation, like he's mentally somewhere else as he eats the watermelon, exhibiting disassociation, another common trauma response. Mark says he's going back to work, and when Helly confronts him to ask him why he doesn't care that Irving's gone, Mark says, because he's not dead, he's just not here. This is a statement that his Audi echoes in the same episode, referring to Gemma, as I discussed in part 1 of this deep dive. It's a clue that his Audi and innie selves are bleeding into each other due to reintegration. Dylan passive-aggressively asks Mark if he's caught up with Helly yet, and told her Miss Casey is his wife. which is information that Helly hadn't heard yet. She's been through so much trauma, and this had to be upsetting to hear from Dylan just blurting it out like this after she and Mark had been forming a relationship in season 1. When Helly takes off after Mark and asks what they're going to do about this, saying they can work as a team and figure out a plan regarding Miss Casey, Mark breaks down and finally lets his emotions out, saying, "There is no we. It doesn't matter, because they're smarter than us. They know everything. Me looking for Miss Casey, us wandering departments, mapping the floor, all of it. They've known everything we're doing because Helena told them." So Mark feels totally helpless and defeated, after having been deceived by Helena and going to so much trouble to make a plan for finding his outy's wife. Now he knows all of that effort was for nothing because Helena was a mole, and of course she reported all of their plans and activities. No matter what, the innies are always at a disadvantage because they just don't have the knowledge or the tools to fight the higher-ups. They're like innocent children in many ways, and Mark is realizing this now and becoming cynical. The people in control at Lumen are always going to be a few chess moves ahead of them, watching and listening to them all the time and keeping them in the dark about so much. Now, feeling like we're in control of our own lives and having bodily autonomy, these are extremely important things to human beings. Mark and Helly are both reeling right now from the trauma of realizing they don't have either of these things at all. Helly tells Mark, "That wasn't me. I'm not her. I'm me, Helly," to which Mark replies, "And how do I know that?" And truthfully, he has no way to be sure that it really is Helly now. But she says that he just has to trust her, saying, "This is real. Not everything here is a lie." But so much of their reality is fabricated by the Lumen executives, just as the innie Peggy warns her outie Peg in the Lexington letter story. She says, "Nothing they say is real." However, the relationships that the innies form with each other here, when they're real innies, like this real Helly here, that's real. That part is real. It's just not going to be easy for Mark to overcome his disillusionment and trauma and be able to fully trust in people again. I have to point out here, this shot showing half of Mark obscured by a wall, this was definitely symbolic of the fact that the line between his innie and outie selves is becoming increasingly blurred by this reintegration process. The shot remained like this for a lengthy amount of time, even as their conversation became increasingly emotional. The camera didn't cut to their faces as one would normally expect. And when Helly walks away, we come back to a shot of Mark by himself in the same position. The show does a brilliant job in using visual imagery like this to convey symbolism, metaphor, and major themes of the story. Later, as Mark works alone at his desk, he gets a sharp pain in his head, surely a symptom of the reintegration, of course. He looks up at the clock and goes to the elevator to leave, 6 minutes early, which is not like him at all. Then Milchick points this out that he's leaving 6 minutes early and accosts him there, getting in his face in the elevator. Mark clearly knew he was leaving early without permission, and his attitude toward Milchick in this scene is indicative of how fed up he is with Lumen and how much he's changed as an innie. Innie Mark used to be innocent, happy, carefree, and gullible, like when he earnestly said in season 1 that their work is mysterious and important. Of course, he was never as pious as Irving, who was outraged that Mark and Dylan were making fun of him at the supposedly sacred perpetuity wing with the bingo game. But Mark was definitely content with his work life and generally behaved like a good company man back then. Now he's done a total 180. In this episode, he's depressed, emotionally closed off, and sarcastic. All traits of his outie, as a matter of fact, so it could indicate that parts of his outie are bleeding through to him. But his altered attitude and darker state of mind are also just natural consequences of his journey of self-discovery and enlightenment that Rickon's book sent him on, starting in season 1, and now the trauma he's been through after Helena's deception and violation of him. It's all contributing to this changed mentality. What's fascinating about it is that innie Mark is becoming more cynical and losing his sense of purpose, while simultaneously his outie is gaining a sense of hope and purpose now that he's discovered Gemma is alive and he's decided to reintegrate. It's like his innie and outie have traded places in terms of their mentality. Anyway, Mark sarcastically asks Milchick if Miss Wong took notes at Irving's funeral and says he can't wait to read about it in the bullshit Gazette. Of course, this is a reference to the Kier Chronicle that Milchick showed him in the Season 2 premiere, which he has now realized is fabricated propaganda since his eyes have been fully opened to Lumen's bullshit. He says more facetious things, ending with a sarcastic praise Kier, and this prompts Milchick to get up in his face even more. Milchick asks, "Did you and Helly R catch up? Did you tell her that you effed her outie at the Ortbo? Helena Egan, leader-in-waiting at this company." Then he just turns on his heel and says, "Have a restful evening," and leaves him there looking stunned. Now, Mark had already found out, of course, that Helena is an Egan, but it seems that it hadn't occurred to him maybe that Helena had told people what she did with Mark. He assumed Helena informed others about all their actions on the floor in searching for Miss Casey, so he should have considered that she may have told people about her encounter with him sexually, but that was the most painful aspect of her deception for him, so it makes sense that he's probably just been blocking that part out. Remember, Helena tricked him into sleeping with her, and I would argue that this amounts to SA by deception, as he thought he was consenting to sleeping with Helly, who is not the same person as Helena. They have two distinct identities within the same body, with two different sets of memories, so he feels violated. And for Milchick to throw this in his face was uncharacteristically cruel. But this is the result of the extremely harsh performance review that he received in this episode, as I discussed in part 1 of this deep dive. After being eviscerated by Drummond, Milchick declares that he's tightening the leash, desperate to win the approval of Lumen and this cult of Kier, by which he's clearly been indoctrinated as a true believer. So he makes sure to let Mark know that he's going to be watching his every move, taking note of him leaving 6 minutes early and throwing this traumatic incident in his face. And going forward, I expect Mark to continue to be volatile as he's dealing with the effects of his reintegration. Aspects of his outie persona may continue to bleed through, and he will continue to grapple with his trauma, as will Helly, who also feels violated by Helena. And Dylan will likely rise to the occasion and go looking for the export hall to make up for not listening to Bird. Milchick, for his part, will continue hardening his approach to managing the severed floor, becoming harsher and more strict in a desperate effort to win Lumen's acceptance. So that's it for part 2 of my deep dive into Season 2, Episode 5, and now I want to know what you think. What did you think of Innie Mark's behavior in the aftermath of Woe's Hollow? What do you think Dylan will do about the note that Irving hid? And what are your theories about the export hall and the testing floor? And what was up with that mystery man who took dental tools to the testing floor, and why was his identity concealed from us? Let me know your thoughts and theories down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and check out my Severance call-in lives on Mondays at 10:15 p.m. Eastern. And until next time, keep on deep diving, and let's see what we can uncover together.